In 1483, Anne Neville was crowned Queen of England, yet in mere months it would all unravel. Her only son died the next year, leaving England without an heir. Anne was devastated, but her nightmare was just beginning. Anne Neville was born in a time of chaos. The Wars of the Roses had just begun, and the end was nowhere in sight. In fact, Anne would never see peace in her entire life. And, to make matters worse, Anne's father was right in the middle of the action. It's hard to stay out of the conflict when your father is the infamous Kingmaker. Anne's father was Richard Neville, the 16th Earl of Warwick. Today he's known as the Kingmaker for his role in helping not just one, but two separate men claim the throne of England. Her dad may have been one of the most important men in England, but Anne's mother was no slouch herself. Anne's mother, Anne de Beauchamp, was one of the wealthiest women in the entire kingdom, and that made her inheritance very interesting to anyone who wanted power in England. Thanks to her ruthless father and her extravagant mother, men would be fighting over Anne Neville for her entire life. Under normal circumstances, Anne Neville and her older sister Isabel would barely have seen a cent of their parents' vast estates. But one fact changed everything. The couple never had a son. As Isabel and Anne grew older, Anne actually had a charmed childhood hidden away at the luxurious Middleham Castle. It was here that she came across two young men with whom the rest of her life would be inextricably linked. Their names were Richard and George, but it was their last name that mattered, York. The Nevilles were distantly related to the rebellious Richard, Duke of York, the man many believed would become king by the time the Wars of the Roses were over. As such, York sent his two youngest sons, Richard and George, to live and train at Middleham Castle. There, the two boys came to know the sisters Anne and Isabel very well. In just a few years' time, each of the brothers would marry one of the sisters, and yet all of their unions would end horribly. Now, any plans that the Kingmaker and the Duke of York had went up in smoke in 1460, when the Duke lost his life in battle against the forces of his nemesis, the mad King Henry VI. It seemed like maybe the Duke's end might mean the Wars of the Roses were over, but no. The Yorkists rose up yet again and deposed Henry, making the Duke's eldest son King Edward IV. If the war ended with the Duke of York, maybe Anne Neville could have had a normal life. But instead, she was in for a roller coaster ride. In 1469, Anne's sister Isabel married the king's brother, George. The same George who had spent his childhood at the Neville's castle. It seemed like a completely obvious match, but these were uncertain times. While a Kingmaker had been Edward's greatest ally in his rise to the throne, everything changed once Edward became king. The Kingmaker found himself being pushed aside and he wouldn't stand for it. In a move that completely shocked all of England, Richard Neville, Anne's father, had Anne engaged to the mad King Henry's son, Edward of Westminster. Fed up with the king he helped make, Neville completely switched sides and joined the enemy. The Wars of the Roses started right back up again, and this time Anne found herself right in the middle of it. Edward of Westminster had been living in France with his mother when Anne and her father sailed across the English Channel to meet up with them. And in 1470, Anne Neville married Edward. As long as everything went according to the Kingmaker's plan, the two of them would be king and queen of England before long. But to say things didn't go according to the plan would be an understatement. In a strange twist of fate, Anne Neville and her sister Isabel found themselves on the exact opposite side of the Wars of the Roses, thanks to their respective husbands. At this time, Anne's new father-in-law, the deposed King Henry VI, was locked up in the Tower of London. Not long after Anne and Edward's wedding, the whole gang set sail for England to free the king and put him back on the throne. But unfortunately, there's one thing that the Kingmaker didn't account for. Richard Neville thought he had one ace in the hole. His son-in-law, George, King Edward IV's brother. George resented his brother almost as much as Neville did, and so Neville assumed that George would back him up. But the thing is, George wanted the throne for himself. He wasn't about to help the Kingmaker put crazy old Henry VI back on the throne. Anne's marriage to Henry's son sealed it. George realized Neville would never help him become king, so he abandoned the Kingmaker and rejoined his brother. Now the English countryside broke out into open conflict once again. And this time, the Kingmaker's luck had finally run out. His forces met King Edward's on the field at the Battle of Barnet, and it was an utter disaster. Richard Neville, Anne's father, lost his life in the fray. But after Barnet came the Battle of Tewkesbury. The first time, Anne lost her father, and this time, she lost her husband. The king's forces slew Prince Edward in battle, and suddenly, Anne found herself in terrible danger. King Edward's forces took Anne prisoner after the battle. That couldn't have been a comfortable place to be. After all, her father had betrayed the Yorkists, and her husband had been their sworn enemy's son. But remember how Anne stood to inherit one of the biggest fortunes in all of England? This would end up saving her hide. The king didn't really know what to do with Anne after he'd captured her. She was the Lancastrian prince's widow and daughter of the hated Kingmaker, but there was still all that money to be had. He ended up leaving her with his brother George. At first, that seems ideal. After all, George's wife was Anne's sister, Isabel. But if George, Duke of Clarence, had his way, Anne never would have seen the light of day again. With her out of the picture, that meant his wife Isabel would inherit their mother's entire fortune. But Anne Neville was an important woman, and the world wasn't about to forget about her. Countless men across England probably wanted her hand in marriage, and one of those men was none other than George's own brother, Richard, who had spent time with Anne at Middleham Castle when they were younger. Richard of Gloucester was King Edward IV's youngest brother. That left him well out of the running to be king. But Richard was probably one of the most ruthless men in the history of England. When he wanted something, he got it. So when he set his eyes on Anne Neville, nothing in the world could stop him from getting her. Richard desperately wanted Anne's hand in marriage, but he was going to have to fight for it. His oldest brother, the king, didn't want him marrying the Kingmaker's daughter. The middle brother, George, wanted the inheritance all to himself. Both of them pulled out all the stops to try to make sure Richard never got within 100 feet of Anne, but they underestimated their cunning brother. So much for sisterly love. Isabel was right there with her husband George and trying to make sure no one ever saw Anne again. The couple planned to hide Anne away in a nunnery for the rest of her life, but Richard of Gloucester couldn't be stopped. According to some accounts, George and Isabel went so far as to force Anne to live as a servant, working discreetly in a London kitchen, to hide her from Richard's gaze. Even if it's true, it didn't make a difference in the end. Richard of Gloucester managed to track Anne down and escort her to a sanctuary at the Church of St. Martin's-le-Grand, where George, her sister, or even the king couldn't get to her. Once Richard had found Anne, he did something no one expected. He actually agreed to give up most of her inheritance. He told his brother that if he consented to their marriage, he'd renounce his rights to Anne's most lucrative lands and properties. If nothing else, this seemed to prove that Richard actually loved Anne, but with Richard, there was always more than there seemed. Even after all the work Richard put in to finally marry Anne, they still had to keep the whole affair shrouded in secrecy. We still don't know when exactly they tied the knot, but we know that by the spring of 1472, Anne and Richard were officially husband and wife. Now, official records claim that Anne's first husband, Edward of Westminster, lost his life at the Battle of Tewkesbury, but he might have met a much darker end. Many in England thought that Richard of Gloucester had personally chased the prince to the doors of Tewkesbury Abbey. The church was supposed to offer sanctuary for anyone within, but that couldn't stop a man like Richard. If you believe the stories, Richard stormed into the abbey and personally cut down Edward of Westminster. Anne's twisted love life was even more messed up than it seemed. Not only were Anne and Richard not so distantly related, but since Edward and Richard were cousins by blood, many in the church believed that it was immoral for Anne and Richard to marry. Their intertwined family tree meant that Richard needed to get special permission from the Pope to marry Anne, but of course, nothing can be that simple. Everyone knew that Richard needed the Pope's blessing to marry Anne, but what we don't know is whether or not he actually got it. Though some accounts claim they received permission, there's no actual record of it. Down the line, there was every possibility that Richard's enemies could use this fact against him, but their marriage would implode long before anyone got the chance. Now, once married, Anne and Richard settled into their childhood home at Middleham Castle, where they'd first met so many years ago. King Edward made Richard governor of the north, and Anne's life finally saw some level of peace. About a year after their marriage, Richard and Anne welcomed a child. As if names weren't already confusing enough during the Wars of the Roses, they named him Edward. Edward of Middleham came from some seriously tough stock. His grandfather was the Kingmaker, his father was the burly Richard of Gloucester, and his uncle was the towering King Edward IV. Unfortunately, none of that shone through with young Edward. He was a sickly boy from the very beginning. The couple must have hoped their boy would grow stronger as he got older, but instead, he only got worse. Now, all the fighting between Anne and Isabel had been on account of their mother, Anne de Beauchamp, but it's not like Anne was dead or anything. Ever since her husband lost his life in battle, she'd holed herself up where King Edward couldn't come for her. She hoped that time would heal all wounds, and eventually King Edward would let her reclaim her estates. Now remember how Richard claimed he didn't want anything to do with Anne de Beauchamp's vast fortune? Turns out that wasn't exactly true. Richard played the part of the kind son-in-law, rescuing Anne de Beauchamp, but with Richard of Gloucester there was always a reason. With the elder Anne under his watchful eye at Middleham, he could make sure that he got her lucrative inheritance. I'm sure that George and Isabel would have had something to say about that, but in the end, it wouldn't matter. Isabel passed in 1476 from complications in childbirth. Isabel had plotted to make sure that Anne didn't receive their mother's inheritance, and yet she didn't even live long enough to see it. Anne's brother-in-law, George of Clarence, spent his entire life scheming and plotting, and it finally came back to bite him in the end. George had rebelled against his brother, King Edward, countless times over the years, but in 1478, George ran out of luck. Edward's merciful streak ended, and he had George executed. Anne must have had at least some affection for her sister and brother-in-law. After both Isabel and George passed, Anne took in their children for a time. One of the kids that Anne took in would grow up to become the infamous Margaret Pole, who dared to cross Henry VIII and ended up paying for it with her life. If Anne showed some fondness for Isabel and George by taking in their children, Richard completely cancelled out that kindness. According to some stories, Richard personally saw to his own brother's execution. That's bad enough, but how he did it is truly disturbing. He had his own brother drowned in a cask of wine. Now by 1483, the Wars of the Roses had been over for a decade. King Edward IV held the throne securely at the time, and he had two healthy sons to inherit it. So, when Edward suddenly passed, it may have shocked England, but no one panicked. At least this time, it seemed like the transition would become smooth and simple, but you're not accounting for Anne's husband, Richard, the man who always got what he wanted. In what turned out to be a horrible mistake, King Edward made his brother Richard Lord Protector when he passed. Basically, Richard was supposed to look after the country while his 12-year-old nephew, the new King Edward V, came of age. Richard wasn't about to let his snotty nephews take the throne that should have been his. He wanted that crown, and he pulled one of the most twisted stunts in the history of England to get it. Poor Edward V never even got the chance to be king. Richard brought Edward and his younger brother to the Tower of London for protection, then promptly threw away the key. Edward IV wasn't even cold yet, and Richard dealt him a chilling betrayal. He had his brother's marriage invalidated, declared that his nephews were illegitimate, and made himself King Richard III instead. Against all odds, the Kingmaker's daughter had become the Queen of England. As for Richard's nephews, no one ever saw them again. The world remembers them as the tragic princes in the Tower, and historians widely agree that Richard eventually had the both of them secretly executed. Richard and Anne officially became the King and Queen of England on July 6, 1483. The Archbishop of Canterbury crowned them both in a joint ceremony, one of the most extravagant coronations England has ever seen. Almost every single noble in England showed up for the spectacle. However, amongst all the glitz and glamour, there was one glaring absence. Their son, Edward of Middleham, the new heir to the throne of England, was nowhere to be seen at his parents' coronation. Edward had been a sickly baby, and by now, he'd grown into a sickly boy. On the big day, he was too ill to make it out and face the crowds. After their ridiculously extravagant coronation, Anne and Richard went on tour. They traveled all across England to show the kingdom their new monarchs. Maybe they had hoped that all of this would make the country forget about the princes in the Tower and accept them as the rightful king and queen. Now in April 1484, the day Anne had been fearing for a decade finally came. Her feeble son Edward suddenly passed. No one knows exactly what happened to him, but no one was surprised when it happened. Edward was living on borrowed time since the day he was born, and the Reaper had finally come for him. Edward spent much of his life living in the country at Middleham Castle. His parents hoped that keeping him away from the hustle and bustle of the city would finally bring his strength to him, but it never came. In a cruel twist of fate, Anne and Richard were actually en route to Middleham to visit their son when they heard the news he was gone. If he'd held out for just a few more days, they could have said goodbye, but they didn't make it. To say the news hit them hard would be an understatement. The loss of young Edward understandably left Anne and Edward absolutely devastated. After she lost her son, Anne focused all of her devotion on her nephew, George and Isabel's son Edward. Richard had lost his heir to the throne, but at least Anne could still have a boy to love and dote upon. But it wasn't enough. The loss of her son hit Anne hard. Her nephew couldn't fill the void that young Edward had left, and within months of the boy's loss, Anne started fading away. Perhaps she had simply lost the will to live, but from the moment she lost her boy, Anne's days were numbered. Just months after Edward of Middleham passed, Anne Neville joined her son in the afterlife. Based on contemporary accounts, modern historians believe it was tuberculosis, but it was clearly more than that. She was only 28 years old, in the prime of her life, but in the blink of an eye, she was gone. Illness may have claimed her, but it seemed that Anne had simply lost the will to live. Now, if you enjoyed this video, do hit the like button, and if you're interested in more historical stories like this one, make sure to subscribe.